Ukraine attacks oil facilities in Russia, which is benefiting from higher fuel prices and sanctions relief due to the Iran war. It comes after Moscow launches intense aerial attacks on its neighbour. How is the Iran war affecting Russia and Ukraine? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Adrian Finighan. The fourth anniversary of the war in Ukraine had passed when the US and Israel attacked Iran at the end of February. The causes of both conflicts may not be linked, but they are intertwined. A common factor, of course, is the US, waging war on Iran, an ally of Russia, while also involved in Ukraine. Kyiv has offered help to countries under Iranian attack with drone technology and know-how honed back home. Russia has benefited from the US relaxing sanctions, allowing it to sell oil as the world faces a supply crisis due to the turmoil in Iran. US President Donald Trump's efforts to forge a deal between Russia and Ukraine have stalled for now, meaning that attacks continue with ferocity. So where does the balance lie now in the Ukraine war? And what impact are events in the Middle East having on the conflict in Europe? We'll talk to our guests shortly, but first a report from Felix Nayawara.
Oil tankers are once again center stage in the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. The US, Europe and G7 countries imposed sanctions on Moscow's energy fleet in 2022 after its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But the effects of the US and Israeli war on Iran are being felt in Europe. To help reduce the impact of rising fuel prices, the US has partially lifted oil sanctions on Russia twice since March. And Kyiv says the move only emboldens Moscow.
Окреме питання – санкції проти Росії.
The separate issue is sanctions against Russia for this war, which must push Russia towards genuine diplomacy. Unfortunately, there is another decision by the US to ease oil sanctions. There will be no real benefit from this for diplomacy.
Кожен долар від нафти –
Every dollar from oil only encourages Russia to keep fighting.
Ukraine says there are currently 110 Russia-linked vessels at sea. It says they are carrying an estimated 12 million tons of oil. Kyiv estimates the value to be at $10 billion. And Kyiv says that revenue is directly put towards the war. Last week, Russia launched one of its most intense aerial attacks yet, hitting civilian and other targets across Ukraine.
Turn it over to Kelly.
But White House officials say the sanctions waiver will cushion global markets from energy supply shocks.
We're nearing the end.
The war in Iran has restricted transit through the Strait of Hormuz, a critical route for oil and gas from the Gulf. The Iran war has brought Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelenskyy to the region. Kyiv has been leveraging its experience in drone warfare to help Gulf nations counter Iranian drone strikes. In late March, Zelenskyy advanced security deals in Saudi Arabia, the UAE and Qatar. Meanwhile, Ukraine has been attacking Russian oil infrastructure, seeking to limit the windfall it has been getting from higher prices. On the sanctions front, Russian officials say they've adapted.
We
have already learned to act in such a way to minimize the impact of such measures on our interests. We'll continue to do so.
Europe has criticized the US waiver on Russian oil, even as it faces a looming energy crisis itself. The EU has collectively spent an additional $25 billion to import energy since the start of the Iran war. The International Energy Agency warns the crisis will deepen in the coming weeks if restrictions at the Strait of Hormuz are prolonged. This has spurred Europe to accelerate clean energy production and explore alternatives to reduce reliance on Gulf energy imports. Kyiv hopes that energy gap can be filled quickly before its allies in Brussels find themselves turning to Moscow in more challenging times. Felix Nyawara, Al Jazeera, for Inside Story.
Let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Moscow is Chris Weafer. He's the CEO of Macro-Advisory, a strategic consultancy focused on Russia and Eurasia. In Berlin is Stephen Erlanger, the chief diplomatic correspondent for Europe at the New York Times. And in Yerevan in Armenia is Michael Bociurkiw, a global affairs analyst and a senior fellow at the Atlantic Council. Gentlemen, welcome to you all. Let's start with you, Chris. If Kyiv is right, we're talking about a very significant jump in revenue for Moscow here. How big a boost is that in practical terms for Russia's war effort? Is the Iran war effectively now propping up Russia through higher oil prices?
Well, yeah, Russia is certainly making a lot more money from its oil exports and has been since the Gulf War started. It's estimated that Russia made an extra just close on $10 billion for the budget from the higher oil and gas sales in March. Obviously that higher prices and volumes are continuing. So it's definitely making a lot of money. But it is incorrect to say that the higher oil revenues have in any way saved Russia or has altered perhaps what was expected in terms of Russia's approach in the Ukraine conflict. Russia was planning on a big budget deficit for this year. The higher oil revenue will mean that the budget deficit, assuming all else is equal, will be a lot less and they'll have to borrow a lot less. But it really doesn't change much in terms of economic performance, or it doesn't really either alleviate much of the pressure on the government or on the economy. It just means they have to borrow a lot less money. But clearly it will depend on what happens next and how long this situation lasts. But in March, it was worth about $10 billion. We don't know how much that will be in April or May because there are a lot of variables and a lot of secrecy, a lot of speculation about volumes and prices, etc. You only get the full picture several weeks after the end of each month, but clearly a big boost in revenues.
Okay, Stephen, let's look at it from the other side. If that revenue continues to hold up for Russia, what does that do for Ukraine in terms of its position in the war?
Well, I don't think it changes it very much. I mean, from what Chris said, and I'm sure he's right, Russian spending plans haven't changed very much. What's changed is the amount of money they expect to be able or to have to borrow. I mean, Russia's in a very difficult situation in Ukraine, not because it's losing, but because it's not winning. It's not making a lot of progress. So what we have is a fairly stagnant front line where actually the Ukrainians are gaining a bit more ground. You have, the war against Ukrainian civilian infrastructure from the Russian side and against Russian energy infrastructure from the Ukrainian side. Now, the Ukrainians, I think, will be more impacted by a scarcity of air defense missiles because so many of them have been used by America and by its allies in the war in Iran. So it'll be harder, I think, for Iran to get the air defenses it needs, even if the Europeans are willing to pay for them. There's just a scarcity there. And the Pentagon itself is worried about its own stocks getting too low. So I think to some degree, that's the main impact.
Michael, the US says that this is about stabilizing markets. It is, as we've just heard, putting billions back into Russian hands. How does the US square that with its European allies?
Yeah, and how does it square it with its relationship with Russia as well? When you think about it, you have verified reporting that Russia has provided targeting information, satellite imagery to the clerics in Tehran to strike U.S. assets throughout the Middle East, as well as striking targets, strategic targets, and critical infrastructure in Israel. And yet, what do? They go around and give this 1-month extension of the waiver. I think European governments are, as they probably wake up every morning now into the Trump administration, waking up and shaking their heads and saying, where are we now? What Donald Trump do we have right now? I think what you're seeing is a lot of capitals trying to recalibrate to have a different orientation, less on the United States, as we're doing in Canada, by the way, but to think about how can we operate independently of the United States. And one more thing here, because I think it's really important. I hope that group thinking could also work to find a new interlocutor for Ukraine to reach peace with Russia. And what I'm talking about is the U.S. team step away and a new player a player be reintroduced, someone like Turkey, that I think has a lot more skin in the game. It has deep interest in Black Sea security. I think they're now seen as a much more credible interlocutor at the peace table between Ukraine and Russia than the U.S. is. And we're seeing that too right now happening in front of our eyes, and Pakistan taking a leading role in trying to bring peace in the Middle East, with the U.S. stepping back a little bit. So I think those are the dynamics that could play in the longer term in Ukraine's favor.
Chris, how would that play with Russia, though? Would Turkey be seen as a mediator in the conflict?
Well, I think, first of all, it's clear the whole process has stopped because the U.S. has stepped away. I mean, if we go back to the middle of February or even late February, there was actually a reasonably high degree of optimism in Moscow and also in Washington, where we have good contacts and are constantly talking to people about events. There was a lot of optimism around that the process was moving forward towards maybe even the outline of some sort of a peace agreement. Obviously, the issue of Donbass was the key one outstanding, but there appeared to be a lot more optimism. But everything has completely stopped and frozen since February 2028. So right now, the question is, does everything have to wait until the U.S. is done with the Gulf and then it can re-engage with Ukraine, or somebody else steps in? So I am stating the obvious here, but when we talk to officials in Moscow about what they expect, they simply don't know. Yes, I think my impression I get is that they would very much welcome somebody else taking up the reins as mediator and bringing the process forward. But right now, there's nobody doing that. There's nobody obvious. Clearly, Turkey is a country that could do it. Previously, we had the Gulf states that clearly cannot at this stage. China will not. So, yeah, I think we're just in this period of uncertainty and stasis, waiting for either the U.S. to re-engage or for somebody else to step up. And there are very few options. Turkey certainly could be one of those.
Stephen, how would Europe feel about that? With the Iran conflict pulling attention and resources away from Ukraine right now, does everything have to wait?
Well, honestly, it's waiting on Washington, because Washington has leverage on Russia if it chooses to use it. It hasn't chosen to use it much so far. Turkey has very little leverage on Russia. So Turkey, which did host early talks to try to settle the war 3 years ago, that stopped. But Turkey is considered a friend to both sides. But Turkey as a mediator is one thing. The problem is you're mediating between two sides who really don't have a lot to say to one another. And the Americans, at least, have been pushing a form of agreement with pressure that they can exert on both sides, which Turkey cannot do. So I do think things kind of wait for the Americans. I'm not sure the Ukrainians are unhappy, by the way, to have this put to one side. Washington was increasingly pressuring them to actually give up the Donbass in return for, these vague security assurances, and the pressures off Ukraine to do that now And one wonders, whether we're just going to settle into this conflict at this attritional rate for quite a while to come. Though, if you believe Western officials and NATO officials, Russia's losing an enormous number of fighters, 35,000 a month in wounded and killed in March, for instance. So how long Russia can keep doing that? There are reports that Russia is having a little more trouble getting people to join the army despite spending lots of money. So the problem is I can't see a path to victory, frankly, by either side. So perhaps they just exhaust themselves. And if that's true, then maybe Turkey could help.
Michael, Stephen was talking about this war of attrition, the status quo at the moment, with neither side appearing to be in a position in which they can win this war. But are we at least now in a situation, do you think, where wider geopolitical crises keep working in Russia's favor?
Yes, indeed. And as the setup report indicated, Russia is, according to Ukrainian estimates, earning billions and billions more from the extension of this waiver. But I hate to say it, and I say this genuinely because I've just come out of my base in Odessa during that really vicious attack the other night. And there are a couple of things here. Number one is that it is the first time I remember 4 waves of drones flying right over my flat in central Odessa, meaning that, yes, those drones are penetrating Ukrainian defenses. And they're using more powerful drones, more lethal drones, and they are getting through. I see this as I walk the streets of Odessa, where you only have to walk maybe 5 minutes before you see quite a bit of destruction. That's where things are getting at. And the other thing is to do with human capital. Odessa is the capital of Ukraine for entrepreneurialism. You have the toughest men and women working there. A lot of them are leaving. Millions of Ukrainians have fled Ukraine. And I don't know if this war continues ongoing, how many of them will come back. And that is a big issue right now because we need that talent to come back and help rebuild Ukraine. The longer they stay away, I think the less chance is of them coming. But again, I go back to what I see every day in Odessa, and it does worry me because, there is this narrative that the Ukrainians are invincible. Yes, they're great fighters. Yes, they're going to fight to the end. They will not give up territory after so much blood has been spilled. But what is happening underneath and between those cracks to the economy and to the human condition, really?
Chris, going the other way, Ukraine, of course, is hitting ports and refineries and tankers. Does that meaningfully cut into Kremlin revenue and its ability to keep fighting this war? Is the impact perhaps more limited than Kyiv would like to think it is?
I think the evidence is that it's actually more limited. You do see pictures, spectacular blazes in refineries, etc., and a lot of narrative about how much damage it's doing. But then a few weeks later, when the trade data comes out and the revenue data comes out, you see that the impact was relatively limited. So, for example, we now have data from independent sources like Kepler and others that have always been very good, showed that Russia's average daily oil exports in March was at still over 7 million barrels a day when you combine product and pipelines and seaborne exports. So no material impact, even though we know ports like Ust-Luga and Primorsk were down for a few days. But the volumes seem to recover fairly quickly, according to the trade data. And we had that big jump of about $10 billion of extra receipts in March at a time when these facilities were being targeted. So I think the reality is that both sides have adapted to the various attacks from each other. Certainly the damage is extensive but fairly limited and short-lived. And both sides have found ways to work around these frequent attacks. And the evidence is that it's not materially affecting Russia's export ability. It's still able to get oil out on the ships. And with the waiver from the US, those tankers are getting to their destinations. And with the war in the Gulf, they're selling that oil at least market price. And there's even some evidence that Russia is getting a premium for the volumes that it has in Asia. So, yeah, I'm afraid that in terms of the impact of the attacks is very limited, if actually overall negligible.
Okay, Stephen, what do you make of that? All right, limited effectiveness of Ukrainian attacks on Russian oil infrastructure. But I mean, there's a risk, isn't there, for Ukraine in pursuing that line of targeting, that choking supply will simply push prices up even further and ends up helping Russia even more financially?
Well, to some degree, that's absolutely true because, world energy prices are fluid and they're not dependent on any particular one thing, though the Strait of Hormuz has certainly made a big difference. I think the importance in the war is part of what Michael talked about, which is just the human and emotional cost of a war that doesn't seem to be ending. And that's true on both sides, I think, because the Russian economy is strained. There's no question. It's not about to go belly up, but it's strained. Russian manpower is, they're having harder time getting people to join the army. Their losses are quite big for very small gains. And so in a way, one does see exhaustion on both sides with no clear exit strategy for either side. And that, to me, is part of the tragedy. I mean, as in Iran, Trump thought the war would be over soon, and it's not. And Putin thought Ukraine would fall soon, and it didn't. And the hardest thing you have is this kind of bloody stalemate that goes on and on and on, where both sides are kind of stuck in glue, losing people, losing money, with no clear end in sight.
And Michael, how, economically speaking, how long can Ukraine sustain this? It's fighting the war, but also fighting the price pressures that come with fighting a war.
Yeah, and let's share a bit of good news with the audience. I mean, now with the massive electoral change in Hungary, it does look like that $90 billion loan that was set up by the EU, backed by Russian assets, will finally get released to Ukraine. And it can't come any sooner because Ukraine has to pay its army. Ukraine has to pay also pensions and teachers' salary, that sort of thing. It's really coming to the end of the line in terms of finances. So it's really, really important that money come. And but that will only last perhaps 2 years or so. And then, a lot of what's happening right now in Ukraine is a lot of the burden of the war is also falling on the shoulders of private individuals and entrepreneurs through taxes.
Chris,
could I just say one other thing here?
Very quickly, Michael. Yeah, very quickly.
Yeah, just very quickly. And that's why it's important. I'm in Armenia right now. Is that also a democratic experiment? It's got Russia on one side, Iran on the other, Azerbaijan, Turkey. So it's really, really important to support these thriving democracies that find themselves in very tough neighborhoods.
All right. I'm going to come backwards through you now, Stephen. Politically, who has the momentum in this war at the moment? Is it Kyiv or Moscow?
Frankly, I don't see anybody having momentum. That's my honest answer. And without the Americans involved, nothing's happening.
Okay. That certainly was very brief. Do you want to expand upon that?
Well, just simply to say that I do think the Americans have made significant efforts to try to end the war. And it has been very, very difficult to do that. So without the Americans deeply involved, they're still providing intelligence to Ukraine, but you can tell Trump's getting bored with it. Trump's involved with lots of other things.
Okay.
And I just don't see any clear replacement for the leverage that the U.S. can apply to both sides if it chooses to do so.
And Chris, if prices stay high, exports keep moving, does that give Russia a fairly stable financial base to continue with this war? Do you see any chance at all for de-escalation here?
Look, I think we need to kind of separate the two issues. One, can they afford it, and the other about the willingness. On the affordable side, well, really, the situation in January and February when Russia's oil receipts were significantly down about 50% on the previous year, that was adding to the budget deficit. But Russia could afford to fund that. So, as we said earlier, the fact that it's had a spike in revenue means that the finance minister can sleep a bit better at night. He has to borrow less money, but it really doesn't change the economic position. The economy has gone into kind of a kind of just almost like a life support, a very low level of activity, but that's sustainable. There's no prospect of a crisis. There's nothing on the horizon. Equally, the $10 billion extra a month is not going to lead to any additional growth. But putting that to one side, there is I can say, a very noticeable war fatigue in Moscow. People are much more openly talking about when is this going to end? Like, what are the objectives? An expression that you hear a lot in Russia these days is from a Russian saying, we are tired of being part of history. And what I mean is that, as you know, in January, Russia's involvement in this conflict was longer than Russia's involvement in the Great Patriotic War. So it's led to a kind of more of a debate about how long this is going to last. We're now in a historic conflict, as it were, for Russia. It's the longest one it's been involved in, and people are tired of it and are talking about it. And that has led to concern about maybe what might happen coming up to the September elections. And it's one of the reasons why we are facing more difficulty with the internet, more outages, as we've already seen on my transmission here. There is some nervousness from the government over public support for this conflict.
Michael, I've got about a minute left on the programme. You heard about the war fatigue in Moscow. Where does the Iran conflict leave Ukraine in all of this, given that it seems to be no longer a central priority for Washington?
Well, on the one hand, Mr. Zelenskyy has been very adept at forming leverages with the Gulf states, for example, the UAE, where they're begging for Ukraine's know-how and technology. Hence, I have argued in op-eds and elsewhere where he should ask for their support in terms of putting pressure on Russia, even if it comes to telling people in Mr. Putin's circle, no more parking your yachts in our warm waters, no more investment, no more tourism, if that's what it takes. But on the other hand, there is the problem of what the other panelist alluded to was the lack of Patriot missile systems or whatever, not to bring down drones, but those very, very fast cruise missiles, of which we had quite a few get through the other day. That is a very, very big worry, because a lot of Ukrainians are telling me that they're now feeling that no inch of Ukraine is safe anymore. It's become that bad.
Gentlemen, there we have to end it. Many thanks indeed for taking part in the programme. Chris Weafer in Moscow, Stephen Erlanger in Berlin, and Michael Bociurkiw in Yerevan. Thanks for watching. You can see the programme again at any time by going to the website. That's at aljazeera.com. For further discussion, join us at our Facebook page at facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And of course, you can always join the conversation on X. Our handle there at AJ Inside Story. For now, that's it from me, Adrian Finighan, and the team here in Doha. Al Jazeera's live coverage continues in just a moment. Stay with us.